On April 15, 1900, a colossal World's Fair, the size of 300 soccer fields, opened in Paris. Over the next 7 months, 51 million visitors from around the world were dazzled by technological innovations that would revolutionize their lives, such as electricity.
The star of the fair was electricity. It heralded the 20th century.
And the first subway line.
It was such a success that they had to call upon the police. It was just too crowded.
Some 120 years later, the ingenious buildings remain a vital part of the City of Light.
The World Fair changed the face of Paris.
Back then, people were astounded by the size of these structures, such as the 14,000 square meter glass nave of the Grand Palais, as big as 11 Olympic-sized pools.
It's the biggest there is. You couldn't imagine anything bigger.
The low-slung Pont Alexandre III offered an uninterrupted view from the Grand Palais to the Invalides, 1 kilometer away.
It was a great technical feat to build an arch this wide without any intermediate support.
Even more striking, trains entered Gare through a tunnel along the Seine.
They could get across the tunnel because there were some of the first electric trains.
This extraordinary construction site relied on a small army of laborers.
There weren't computers. They needed quite a lot of staff, several hundred workers.
To dazzle exhibition visitors, the architects and engineers overcame huge technical challenges. They installed over 15,000 glass plates on the dome of the Grand Palais. They ripped open the streets of Paris to build the first subway line, and they used a brand new process known today as reinforced concrete to build the main stairs of the Petit Palais.
It is completely separated from the wall. It couldn't be made out of stone.
Under a tight deadline, buildings were erected in less than 3 years, record time for such a huge area.
Construction-wise, the subway of Paris is an amazing feat.
The date was set. They couldn't stray off course.
You're about to see the sights that amazed visitors to the exposition, as architects and engineers defied classical building rules to erect these spectacular monuments. Then witness how these buildings were reconfigured to suit the needs of this ever-changing city. Come discover the incredible heritage of the 1900 exposition. On April 15, 1900, the French capital launched the biggest World Fair ever assembled. Spread over 216 hectares, 83,000 exhibitors from around the world were invited to showcase their most amazing achievements. It was the largest celebration ever put together in France.
The World Fair was like opening a huge toy chest. It was a mix between a modern-day amusement park and a science and knowledge fair, showcasing French industries.
Visitors had access to a Ferris wheel and a huge telescope. They could also attend hundreds of parties, balls, and symphony concerts during the exposition that ended up lasting 212 days.
Each World Fair hosted by Paris has left an invaluable heritage to the city, as evidenced by the Palais de Chaillot in 1937 or the Eiffel Tower in 1889, year of the World Fair that preceded that of 1900. This particular celebration had been a huge success and attended by some 28 million visitors.
The 1889 World Fair impressed the Western world as well as the rest of the planet. It was marked by the construction of the Eiffel Tower, which soon became the symbol of Paris.
Watch a TV series or a movie set in Paris, and at one point the characters will stand in front of the Eiffel Tower. It's clearly the city's calling card.
Competing with the prior fair proved to be a challenge. Therefore, instead of betting on a single monumental construction, the organizers decided to erect a multitude of buildings around the capital that can still be enjoyed to this day. Starting with Gare, located on the left bank of the Seine River. Today, it is one of the most famous museums in the world. This impressive 70,000 square meter building houses thousands of paintings and welcomes over 3 million visitors annually. Very few people know that this museum dates back to the World Fair of 1900 and that it was originally a railway station. Certain symbols, such as the huge clock or the impressive pillars, remind us of what it used to be. Back in 1900, the organizers expected a massive turnout thanks to the advent of the railway.
The train was a good way to attract visitors from afar. Many foreigners attended the World Fair of 1900, and they needed to reach the heart of Paris, or at least close enough to the center.
Visitors came from everywhere in France and all over Europe. They came from cities, small towns, villages, and even the countryside.
Yet Paris was not ready to accommodate so many people. It was decided to expand Gare de l'Est and Gare Montparnasse. But this was insufficient, as visitors needed to be brought directly to the heart of Paris, close to the attractions.
The World Fair of 1900 gave the opportunity to build two very important railway stations. Gare de Lyon served the southeast of France all the way to Italy. And since Gare d'Austerlitz was far from the center, it was decided to bring the trains closer to the heart of Paris, which is why Gare d'Orsay was built.
The station was built on the ruins of the Palais d'Orsay, an administrative building that had burned down during the Paris Commune in 1871. The work site along the Seine was massive, yet the station was erected in less than 2 years. The impressive structure sprung up, measuring 173 meters in length and weighing 12 tons, 1.5 times the weight of the Eiffel Tower. In order to link Gare d'Austerlitz to the new Orsay terminus, a new 3,650-meter line was built. It had the unique feature of running underground along the Seine. The split-level ground floor still found in the museum today can be explained by the way the trains entered the station.
In 1900, the trains came in under the station. They followed the Seine through a tunnel, through which they moved by electric traction. This method replaced the usual steam engine that would have released too much smoke.
The lack of smoke allowed the interior of the station to be airy, painted in light colors, and covered by a glass roof bathing the place with light. The surface area equaled 30,000 square meters, the equivalent of 4 soccer fields.
It was a huge glass roof that covered the platforms. And even though these were located further down, the visitor was greeted in the most spectacular way.
Upon arrival at this brand new station, visitors headed towards the entrance of the World Fair. It was only a few hundred meters away, further down from the Champs-Élysées on the Place de la Concorde. 120 years ago, this is where the public would start their visit by going under a spectacular, gigantic door. Built in a mere few months before the grand opening, the monumental door rose 45 meters high, the equivalent of the Statue of Liberty. It comprised 3 great arches, each 20 meters wide and covered by a dome.
It looked like a helmet or an upside-down tureen, with 3 arches sitting on pillars, like some sort of tiara, and it served as the main entrance to the exposition. It had over 50 counters where the visitors would buy their tickets. It was one of the main highlights of the exposition.
40,000 visitors passed through this door every hour. And as they went through, they discovered an unknown and captivating world.
With the purchase of a ticket, the visitor felt something that is hard to conceive today. They held the key to an extraordinary world. Television and radio didn't exist yet. People were a lot less informed than we are today. And so they were entering a world of discoveries. They were amazed. It was a feeling they had never felt before in their entire life.
After purchasing a ticket, visitors entered a Paris that was altered beyond recognition. Its architecture had been transformed specifically for the World Fair. As they walked along the Seine, the visitors saw two huge palaces facing each other, the Petit and the Grand Palais. To this day, they still contribute to the splendor of the capital, now classified as historical monuments. With a surface area of 14,500 square meters, the nave of the Grand Palais is the largest glass roof in all of Europe.
Its sheer size and the space it offers are exceptional. The nave is the biggest covered scene in Paris. It's the biggest there is. You can't imagine anything bigger.
Both palaces were erected specifically for the World Fair of 1900. They were built in only 3 years, which was a technical and architectural feat in and of itself. However, from the very beginning, this project was hindered by tremendous difficulties. The first problem was the proximity of the Seine. The clay sand ground was very unstable and couldn't support the future buildings. In order to reinforce the land, architects decided to use stilts. For 6 months, by day as by night, a total 3,400 oak stakes were sunk 10 meters deep, one after the next.
Wooden stakes were sunk deep into the ground in order to compress the soil and increase its bearing capacity. And then stone foundations were built over that.
Concrete was poured over these stakes to strengthen the ground. Once the foundations were laid, the walls could be built. But the construction lagged behind, as the organizers took several months to appoint the architects in charge of the project. The Grand Palais was at risk of not being completed in time.
They had to make up for lost time. A stricter organization was implemented in order to successfully finish the Grand Palais in due time. As the date had already been set, they couldn't afford to stray off course.
To catch up, various parts of the construction were undertaken simultaneously. The walls were erected at the same time as the structure. The project called for 17,000 cubic meters of stones and 2 million bricks. The heavier parts were lifted by cranes. The biggest challenge was the construction of the famous nave of the Grand Palais. It was the largest glass roof in all of Europe, with its 200 meters in length and 50 meters in width. It covered 1/4 of the entire building. To make it happen, 6,000 tons of steel were required. Laying down the 1,575 glass plates of the dome was quite a challenge in those days. Nothing similar had ever been done with this type of surface. It was a striking sight to see. In order to lay down the plates, huge wooden scaffoldings were set up 40 meters high. All the structural elements were then assembled by hand and fixed with hundreds of thousands of rivets. Once the roof was completed, the entire building was bathed in light.
It's a remarkable building, truly exceptional. It puts forth incredible modernity by showcasing the principle of natural light.
This setting proved to be worthy of its mission. The nave would host the greatest cultural events of the time. Finally, the construction was completed with the facades and stone colonnades, with the main purpose of concealing the inner metallic structures. In total, hundreds of engineers and 1,500 workers collaborated on this project.
There were no computers. They needed quite a lot of staff, several hundred workers, to make this intricate project come true.
Crowned by a lantern 60 meters above the ground, the height of the Grand Palais reached that of the first floor of the Eiffel Tower. As a nod to the previous World Fair, this building alone symbolized the beginning of the 20th century. Erected directly across the Grand Palais, the Petit Palais was based on the same monumental dimensions.
The Petit Palais and the Grand Palais are in line with the Parisian tradition of a major axis, perspective stone architecture, and a majestic set of columns.
How could one build a smaller palace without copying the Grand Palais? Architect Charles Giraud was entrusted with this arduous mission. He decided to erect a monumental entrance porch and to create an inner courtyard instead of a glass roof like in the Grand Palais. The construction called for great artists who used unprecedented techniques, such as this floor paved with a huge mosaic. These mosaics were in fact assembled before being placed on fresh cement. This process is called direct laying. Both this technique and the general inspiration for the building were Italian.
The inner courtyard and colonnade were inspired by the Villa di Giulia in Rome. It's a wonderful Renaissance building, decorated with frescoes both modern and in line with the original criteria.
Just like the Grand Palais, the Petit Palais displayed architectural innovations such as this main staircase.
You can clearly see that this flight of stairs is not supported by anything. It's completely separated from the wall. This means it couldn't be made out of stone. It unequivocally required the use of concrete. In this particular case, the Hennebeek process was used.
The Hennebeek process is also known as reinforced concrete. It consists in mixing cement and metal, an invention newly created in 1900.
It's one of the hidden technical treasures of the Petit Palais. These are not juxtaposed cut stones. In fact, it's a painted decor hinting at the beautiful French architecture from the time of Louis XIV.
The workers disposed of only 2.5 years to build the 7,000 square meters of the Petit Palais. The work wasn't entirely completed by 1900 when the exposition opened. Some parts of the Petit Palais weren't finished. These were cleverly concealed from the visitor's unsuspecting eye. Another 20 years after the exposition would be necessary to complete the painted and sculpted ceiling ornament.
Would today's workers be able to build something identical to the Petit Palais? I think it would be far more complicated and would take much longer.
The two Beaux-Arts palaces were met with unparalleled success during the exposition. 120 years later, they still contribute to the charm of the capital.
All these monuments create such an obvious composition and, as an integral part of the Parisian landscape, it's hard to imagine they weren't there 120 years ago.
Each year, millions of visitors come from around the world, attracted by their collections and their architecture alike. The visit of both palaces was naturally followed by the Pont Alexandre III.
There were a great many visitors. You had women in long dresses, sunshades and hats, along with well-dressed men coming and going, crossing from the Grand to the Petit Palais and walking across the Pont Alexandre III, while admiring the stunning view of the Seine.
The Pont Alexandre III. It remains one of today's most beautiful ornaments of the Seine River. Its dimensions are remarkable, for despite its 45-meter width, it only has one arch that's 107 meters long. Few people know that it was built specifically for the exposition in the vicinity of the Petit and Grand Palais. The main goal was to bring harmony to the surroundings of the palaces, while also creating a new access from the Tuileries to the Invalides.
The bridge had to be laid low to avoid blocking the view. Bridges are often the humpback, and one can't see the other side.
The bridge's height made it possible to admire the opposite bank. Slightly at an angle, it was made to showcase the dome of the Invalides.
They used an original technique, which was basically to build a steel bridge that looked like a stone one.
It was decided to build a single-span bridge without intermediate pillars, instead supported by a single arch. To that end, workers started by building a spectacular yet temporary rolling bridge with a 120-meter span over the river. This temporary bridge allowed them to set into place all the prefabricated supporting steel pieces.
They took huge pieces of steel that they screwed together and shaped like one voussoir, typically forming the arches of a stone bridge. These arches support the bridge, and they obviously rest on both sides of the river.
In total, 15 metallic elements were aligned, thus creating an immense arch. All of it was built in only 3 years prior to the opening of the exposition. To ensure the bridge's weight was supported without the help of intermediate pillars, massive abutments were built on both banks of the river.
We may not realize it today, but the Pont Alexandre III is an incredible technical feat, with its single arch and no intermediate pillars. The engineers of the time were saluted for this remarkable prowess.
The last stage of construction consisted in decoration. Displaying the metallic structure of the bridge was out of the question, so everything was concealed behind a rich ornamentation. The bridge was decorated in honor of the French and Russian alliance and named after Tsar Alexander III, who had died a few years earlier. Certain symbols, such as the nymphs from the Russian river Neva, stand as a reference. Finally, the bridge was illuminated by 32 bronze lampposts.
Big stone columns supporting golden statues were raised on all 4 corners of the bridge. There are garlands and masts on the sides, and even the arches are decorated. This bridge is worthy of appreciation, both as a work of art and a technological feat. It allowed visitors to cross over to the other side of the World Fair, and it's still considered one of Paris's most beautiful bridges to this day.
The organizers of this great celebration had one goal: to dazzle the visitors by proving France's superiority to the entire world.
They were determined to use all means available to the French state to ensure this exposition would be the most striking ever put together in the entire world. And so they used all the necessary technology to create something convincing, both on a technological and an aesthetic level.
The organizers lived up to their promise thanks to one particular invention: electricity. The public discovered a revolutionary source of energy able to power numerous attractions while lighting up the streets and their buildings.
The star of the exposition was electricity. It heralded the 20th century, and people were convinced it would play a crucial role throughout the dawning century.
Over 7 months, more than 38,000 kilowatt hours were produced to light the entire World Fair. This is the equivalent of 1.5 million 100-watt light bulbs used for 24 hours. In order to produce this amount of electricity, a massive Galerie des Machines was built. It housed steel monsters working non-stop at full power. These were 40 machines like this one, each weighing no less than 70 tons and powered daily with full wagons of coal.
For this particular engine, there were between 5 and 6 boilers working constantly with a daily supply of 30 tons of coal.
The maximum power of this single engine was 1,100 kilowatts, which equates to 1,000 flat irons working simultaneously.
It's just like a steam engine. The only difference is that a locomotive uses its wheels to move forward, while this type of steam engine doesn't move. It only has one wheel turning in the center that's called an alternator, and that's what produces electricity.
In comparison, we would need 1,600 of these engines to produce the equivalent of one nuclear reactor.
The engine had to work non-stop, otherwise it would have caused a power outage.
At first, far from winning unanimous support, electricity instilled fear.
Several journalists and part of the public were concerned about the huge amount of electricity being used. They worried and wondered if this electricity might be able to get out somehow and attack them.
How could one reassure the visitors confronted with this new energy source? The organizers had already planned ahead, and right next to the Galerie des Machines, they erected a magnificent palace in honor of electricity. Today, from the foot of the Eiffel Tower, the Champ de Mars spreads over 780 meters. Back then, this is where the Palais d'Électricité was built to show the magical side of this invention. The building was 422 meters long and 60 meters wide, and illuminated by multiple colored lanterns. On top of the palace, the energy was embodied by a ferry. In front, a water tower offering a dazzling sight thanks to its illuminated fountain. This amazing installation required over 10,000 lights. The effort proved to be successful. The public was won over. Thanks to this new source of energy, the spectators could also visit the exposition at night. A genuine revolution.
It was extremely important because it allowed the exposition to close later at night, and it could even offer nighttime entertainment to the visitors.
You have to imagine walking around in brightness. For a visitor of the World Fair in 1900, this was remarkable. It was extraordinary.
From electricity, the star of the exposition, ensued innovations that revolutionized the everyday life of the French people, such as the way they commuted. The electric traction used at Gare was implemented in a new means of transportation within Paris, the subway. To this day, it is still a key feature of Paris. Its 14 lines spread over 220 kilometers underground and over the Seine. It is one of the densest railways in the world, a symbol of the city. Over 1 billion people use the subway every year, which amounts to 49 users per second. Yet few people know that the subway was specifically built for the World's Fair of 1900. Prior to its construction, moving about the capital had proved difficult for the Parisians.
In 1900, moving around Paris was somewhat perilous. There were horse omnibuses, tramways, and thousands of horses all around Paris, struggling to make it to their destination. Traffic jams were everywhere because the city was growing fast and there was no subway.
Shortly before the opening, Line 1 was conceived. The first subway line. Back then, the goal was quite simple: to cross the city from east to west, serving the main attraction sites of the World's Fair, from Porte de Vincennes to Porte Maillot. It was a straight line going through the most popular places of the capital, such as Rue de Rivoli and the Champs-Élysées. But this project was far from earning unanimous support. The subway transgressed a taboo, the idea of entering a dangerous world.
Parisians weren't gophers. You couldn't put people inside tunnels like common miners. For a lot of people, it was unnatural. The underground is the world of the dead. Nothing was worth traveling underground next to the dead bodies.
Going underground was horrendous. They felt they were going to meet the devil.
Some thought the subway would be useless and no one would use it.
The plan was to build an underground subway with electric traction, a first. The size of the station was set to 75 meters in order to extend the length of the trains if need be. Construction received the go-ahead only 2 years prior to the World's Fair. Quite a short deadline for a project of this magnitude.
In terms of construction, the Paris subway is an undeniable feat. The digging started on October 4th, 1898, and the line was opened to the public on July 19th, 1900. In the span of a year and a half, the workers managed to dig 10 kilometers across Paris, which was absolutely phenomenal.
The work site was spectacular. 2,000 cubic meters of rubble were extracted every day.
There were 850,000 cubic meters of rubble. They were evacuated towards the Seine on small wagons set on tramway rails.
Actual construction could then finally begin. 11 shields were brought down in spare parts to be reassembled inside the stations. These were tunnel boring machines in the shape of the section that needed to be built.
A tunnel boring machine is shaped like a cylinder, and it supports the weight of the overhead ground. Once it digs out a few dozen centimeters of dirt, the workers push the machine forward on the already installed overlaying. That way, it progresses on its own path.
Workers dug in front of the shield, while bricklayers would build the vault behind the machine.
The tunnel boring machine moves forward as it progressively digs out the ground. The workers behind it lay down the bricks to permanently support the vault.
These machines dug about 2,800 meters of tunnels. However, work had to come to a stop.
11 shields were provided, but it soon came to light that the ground of Paris at this depth was not suitable for this type of boring.
In fact, the soil underneath Paris was far too unstable. There was a risk the ground could collapse on the workers. It was therefore decided to switch to the cut and cover method. In other words, the trenches were built in the streets in open air.
Parisians could see open trenches in the heart of Paris. Rue de Rivoli was ripped open, even though it was supposed to be a hidden work site at first.
Then, the tunnels were covered with a steel deck.
When you drive, walk, or ride a bike on the Rue de Rivoli, at one point, you're on the steel deck.
Finally, a third method consisted in making a wooden tunnel, as is often the case in mines. The workers dug a tunnel supported by a wooden frame. The ceiling adopted the shape of the final vault. Then the tunnel was widened and bricks were laid on wooden soffits. Aprons were laid down to support the rails. Technical means were not as advanced as they are today, meaning the rails had to be laid down by hand. This gigantic task made timely delivery impossible. Hence, the subway wasn't ready for the opening of the exposition. It is only 3 months later, on July 19, 1900, that Line 1 was finally inaugurated amidst strong apprehension.
The first subway users were nervous about climbing aboard the cars and traveling in the dark. It wasn't an easy thing to do for people back then.
And yet, the users were immediately enchanted. The subway was a complete and utter success. Thousands of people used it on the very first day.
It was such a success that they had to call upon the police. There were too many people in some stations. The crowds had to be controlled.
By the end of the year 1900, 17 million people had used the subway. A success that was such that it was decided to build an entire network across Paris. This led to the 14 lines we know today. 120 years after its construction in 1900, that first line is now entirely automated. And even though the subway doesn't look like it did back then, some of the original features, like this one, were preserved. Designed by architect Hector Guimard, a symbolic figure of Art Nouveau, these subway entrances caused a huge scandal.
People considered them an atrocity and degenerate art. They saw the small, illuminated spheres hanging above the entrance and thought they were the eyes of a monster. It was very divisive. But the main goal of the subway company was to get the people talking about it. In that regard, it was very effective.
120 years later, these subway entrances are classified as historical monuments and considered an exceptional heritage. Back then, building efficient public transit was crucial to allow the public to visit the entire exposition.
You couldn't possibly see the entire exposition in a single day. You had to go back. People went once, twice, 10, 20 times even.
On top of the subway, another means of transportation was designed to facilitate the visit of all the monuments around the Eiffel Tower, such as the Petit and Grand Palais, the Pont Alexandre III, Rue des Nations, and the Palais de l'Électricité. It was the moving walkway. Contrary to the subway, the moving walkway was above the ground.
It was some sort of platform built on top of two viaducts, spreading over 3 kilometers, on which were laid 2 moving walkways.
Each moving walkway offered the users a different speed.
One would move at 4 kilometers an hour, while the other could reach about 8 kilometers an hour.
It allowed the visitors to travel 3.5 kilometers in just 26 minutes.
It was the ancestor of the escalator.
This invention was undoubtedly too advanced for its time. It was completely demolished after the exposition, and the escalators as we know them today were finally developed in big cities many decades later. Finally, to complete this urban development, a footbridge was built in order to allow visitors to gain easy access to both banks. The Passerelle des Billes remains one of the capital's jewels, even though it was supposed to be taken down after the event. The organizers finally decided against destroying this bold construction. Resting on a metallic structure, its uniqueness lies on the fact that it is a through-arch bridge with a 15-meter-high spire. It was the second metallic construction after the Eiffel Tower to be saved, even though it was intended to be destroyed. At the time of the exposition, the visitors used it to admire the magnificent pavilions on both sides of the Seine. Stretching over 1 kilometer along the river, where the 3-lined walkway is today, huge buildings were erected by 40 exhibiting countries. Their main goal was to prove their power through monumental constructions.
The World's Fair was a show of force. The participants wanted to prove that they were competitive, or even that they were better in certain fields.
Each pavilion was competing with the others.
The dimensions of these palaces were spectacular. The German pavilion, for example, had a floor space of 700 square meters and rose 37 meters high, the equivalent of a 12-story building. Despite their beauty, these buildings were not meant to stand through time. After the exposition, they had to be taken apart.
These were temporary buildings. They were made of destructible materials in anticipation of the end of the World Fair. And so they used materials such as jute fiber, cement, and plaster of Paris.
The palaces were built with a simple wooden structure, but to give the illusion of longevity, they were covered with columns and fake decorations. The scenery was so realistic that it made the capital barely recognizable.
When you look at films or pictures of those days, it doesn't look like Paris. It looks like an imaginary land reminiscent of Venice. It's absolutely magical.
If you walk just a few hundred meters, you would pass by a Hungarian palace and a Peruvian one. You could walk between the pavilions. There were Egyptian cafes, and on the Trocadero Hill were the colonies pavilion. You could also enjoy exotic food on the other side.
Even though all these pavilions were destroyed after the celebration, some vestiges still remain in Paris. They were bought, preserved, and scattered all around the capital. Set against the Palais des Manufactures during the exposition, Porte de Sèvres is one of them. 120 years later, it is now in a park behind the church in Saint-Germain-des-Prés in the 6th arrondissement of Paris. Another treasure of the exposition still remains in the heart of Paris inside the Grévin Museum. On the big boulevard, 700,000 visitors come annually to admire wax reproductions of the biggest celebrities. But that is not all. The museum has kept one of the key attractions of the World Fair of 1900, the Palais des Illusions.
It's a room where sections of mirrors are placed, here and there, and at one point, they start to move. There were also projections, and the entire room becomes animated and illuminated. You can see your reflection. It disappears before reappearing. It's absolutely magical.
With this contraption, the setting of a Hindu temple can switch to a jungle. The attraction actually relies on the principle of a giant kaleidoscope. In a hexagonal-shaped room, 6 small mirrors are placed in each corner, in parallel pairs. By rotating these structures by 1/3 of a turn, the entire backdrop of the room suddenly changes.
People were in a state of awe. This complete illusion was a total surprise. This device bears a strong power of attraction, and it still exists today. The most extraordinary thing is that we're still amazed by this.
With around 2 million visitors, the Palais des Illusions was the most visited attraction. In doing so, the World Fair of 1900 heralded the beginning of a new era marked by moving pictures.
It was a place of innovation during a key time, notably for the world of entertainment, the history of cinema, and the audiovisual industry in general.
Exhibitors tried to outdo one another with their innovations, using the latest visual projection techniques. In that regard, the Lumière brothers won over the entire world during the exposition. They had invented cinema 5 years earlier in 1895, with the projection of short movies showing everyday life. But up until then, cinema was nothing more than a fairground attraction. The World Fair would mark a turning point in its history.
Cinema is a French invention. It would be remarkably showcased during the exposition of 1900.
The Lumière brothers were entrusted with an extraordinary challenge.
In 1899, the organizer of the World Fair ordered a very unique performance from Louis Lumière. He wanted a never-before-seen giant projection.
With the help of a giant screen, a broader audience would be able to enjoy these films.
At first, Lumière wanted to make these giant projections under the Eiffel Tower. It would have been even bigger and greater than what he ended up with, but the wind made it impossible to install a giant screen there. That would have been crazy. And so he settled for the famous Galerie des Machines.
A section of the Galerie des Machines was transformed into a reception hall that could accommodate up to 15,000 spectators.
Louis Lumière hung a huge 400-square-meter screen in the hall, but it needed to be kept wet. This ensured the transparency, which was needed in order for the projections to be seen on both sides. So a huge pool of water was placed underneath it. And each day, the screen was dunked in the pool before being lifted back up. It required tremendous machinery.
And when the spectators looked up to the giant screen, they saw none other than themselves.
Louis Lumière showed images of the exposition he had captured a few days earlier. They could see the famous moving sidewalks. The people seemed so fascinated by the camera filming them that they sometimes lost their balance or started fooling around. It was some sort of mise en abîme, showing the exposition during the exposition, which was quite interesting to the audience. That's probably why this attraction was such a huge success. It was an incredible triumph.
In total, these projections were seen by close to 1.5 million people during the 7 months of the exposition. This represented a turning point in the history of cinema, which was recognized as a true art form from that moment on. Thanks to its 420 screens, Paris is the capital offering the most movies in the world. Other inventors tried to compete with the Lumiere brothers' accomplishment. With the Phono Cinema Théâtre, audiences witnessed films with synchronized sound for the first time. The colorful ballet of Loïc Fuller hypnotized the crowds while announcing the advent of contemporary dance. Finally, the Ciné-orama took the spectator on an immersive adventure.
The Ciné-orama was a totally crazy project, imagined by an equally crazy man named Raoul Grimoire-Sanson. He designed a gigantic wooden frame where he placed 10 cameras, one next to the other, on a tray. These 10 cameras worked simultaneously, since there was only one crank angle linked to a single axis, setting into motion all 10 camera mechanisms. These machines were also used as projectors. He then placed this unusual device inside a basket before lifting it off and capturing images.
The goal was to show the audience members a hot air balloon trip as if they were inside the basket, but confronted with numerous technical problems, the screenings were interrupted.
Grimoire-Sanson was able to offer only one screening.
The World Fair was a place where one could leave a mark on the present as well as on future generations, where history was written before the very eyes of the entire world. And it was met with huge success. It recorded more visitors than all the previous expositions. A total of 51 million visitors walked on its ground.
It was a world record, a record that was only broken by the Japanese in Osaka in 1970. It was extraordinary, considering the means available back then. Over 50 million visitors attended the fair of 1900.
This success easily exceeded the hopes of the organizers. Still, after 7 months of celebrations, they finally decided to put an end to the event. On November 12, 1900, the exposition officially closed. While most of the buildings were destroyed, others were immediately given a new life. The Palais des Illusions won over the president of the Gare Museum, who renamed it Palais des Mirages. In 1902, the Petit Palais became the Palais des Beaux-Arts of the city of Paris, housing a permanent art collection dating from the antiquity to the end of the 19th century. On the other hand, the Grand Palais was adapted for various cultural events. Starting in 1901, it hosted a famous horse show and the automobile and aviation show.
This is where the Salon d'Automne took place, giving rise to Fauvism, Cubism, and the great revolutions of modern creation.
To this day, these monuments are adapting to the ambitions of their time. The Grand Palais is undergoing a large-scale renovation, during which it will be closed for several years. In preparation for this work, the architects recreated a 3D model of the original palace as it was built in 1900.
Making a model is like rebuilding the structure backwards. We put ourselves in the builder's shoes and we discovered their advanced technical level, their incredible sensitivity to details, to things that may not have been visible, but which are key to the atmosphere.
Today's architects are modernizing these exceptional buildings while complying with the intentions of yesterday's builders. This way, these landmarks can evolve without being spoiled. In 1900, the World's Fair organized by France marked a turning point and the beginning of the 20th century. Back then, the French capital reached the peak of its influence.
Paris asserted itself as the center of the world. It was the cultural, scientific, and technological capital.
The exposition therefore represented a promise of endless possibilities.
It was associated with several decades of peace, which the old continent hadn't seen for quite some time. And above all, people believed in progress and the ability of human ingenuity to push back the boundaries of progress, with a view to ensuring the well-being of the people.
Even if 14 years later, World War I would crush this utopia of peace, the constructions brought by the exposition continued to intertwine with history when the Grand Palais was used as a military hospital, or when the city fell under German occupation in 1940. More than a century later, the Petit and Grand Palais, the Pont Alexandre III, the Musée d'Orsay, and the subway remain some of the essential symbols of the French capital.
The fair gives us a legacy of monuments and buildings that continue to be Parisian landmarks.
When you walk along the Seine, you can admire the legacy of 1900. All these monuments are appreciated by Parisians as well as outsiders for their true beauty.
Forever adapting to the city's needs, this age-old heritage has many more chapters to write in the history of Paris and France itself.